Imagine being trapped in total darkness, your body wedged between unyielding rocks, with no hope of escape. This is the horrifying reality that these three adventurers had to face. The next three stories will leave you breathless. In October 1989, 18-year-old Rachel Cox found herself deep beneath the surface of South Dakota's Wind Cave National Park. She was part of a group of college students participating in a mock search and rescue operation, a training exercise designed to test their skills in cave exploration and emergency response. Wind Cave, one of the longest and most complex caves in the world, was no ordinary place. Known for its unique boxwork formations, delicate honeycomb-like structures made of calcite, it was a labyrinth of narrow tunnels, hidden chambers, and tight squeezes. The cave's name comes from the barometric winds that blow in and out of its entrance. This phenomenon is caused by differences in atmospheric pressure between the cave and the surface. Rachel had spent 2 weeks exploring the cave with her team, learning its secrets and navigating its challenges. She was no stranger to the cave's eerie beauty, but nothing could have prepared her for the nightmare that was about to unfold. The exercise began like any other. The students were split into teams, tasked with finding their instructors, who were hiding in different parts of the cave. Rachel's team was making good progress, their headlamps cutting through the eerie blackness as they navigated the cave's winding passages. Then, Rachel thought she heard her instructor laughing from a nearby passage. Convinced they were close, she and a teammate decided to investigate. They left their backpacks behind, a decision that would prove to be a critical mistake. They crawled through a narrow tunnel, following the sound, but when they reached the spot, the instructor was not there. Frustrated, Rachel's teammate criticized her decision and headed back to rejoin the group. Rachel, annoyed but determined, paused briefly before preparing to follow. That is when her lamp went out. In the pitch-black silence, Rachel cursed herself for not noticing her lamp was low on fuel. Following her training, she decided to stay put and wait for help. But as the minutes turned into hours, her patience began to wear thin. The darkness was oppressive, the silence deafening. She felt the walls closing in around her, the cold, rough surfaces a constant reminder of her isolation. Desperate to escape, Rachel considered crawling back through the tunnel she had come from. She felt for the opening, squeezed through, and found herself in the wrong passage. She was even more lost than before. Rachel had no food, water, or working light without her pack. She knew her biggest danger was hypothermia, so she forced herself to keep moving. She made as much noise as she could, shouting, singing, banging her lamp against the cave walls, anything to signal for help. Meanwhile, her fellow students and instructors were searching the area where she had disappeared. Rob McLeod, one of her teammates, later claimed that he and Rachel had recently spent 2 weeks in that cave, and they knew it pretty well. So the fact that they had no idea where she could be was very worrying. Wind Cave was a 3-dimensional maze, its passages so dense and interconnected that even experienced cavers could get lost. Rachel's calls for help echoed through the tunnels, but the sound was muffled by the cave's thick walls. The instructors, realizing the severity of the situation, notified the park rangers. The National Park Service quickly mobilized a rescue effort, calling in local cavers and experts from other states. Jim Nepstad, a former Wind Cave specialist, flew in from Kentucky to help coordinate the search. As the hours stretched on, Rachel's situation grew dire. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, making her feel weak and delirious. Her throat was parched, her limbs heavy. The lack of food and water twisted her mind, causing her thoughts to race and blur. At times, she wasn't sure if the strange noises around her were real or just her imagination playing tricks. Then, the hallucinations began. Rachel began to hear whispers in the silence, voices from the cave itself. They were faint at first, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. The cave seemed to come alive, urging her to keep moving, to find her way out. She saw visions of glowing lights and imagined her relatives praying for her return. At one point, she thought she heard a gentle voice saying, "I am the womb of Mother Earth. You are safe. I will birth you." The words were comforting, but they also deepened her sense of disorientation. Rachel was no longer sure what was real and what was a product of her exhausted, starved mind. After about 30 hours of searching, one of the volunteers finally heard Rachel's faint calls for help. They followed the sound, navigating the cave's twisting passages until they found her. Rachel, disoriented and delirious, saw a light approaching and a man with a beard. "Are you God?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The rescuer smiled gently. "No, Rachel, I'm here to take you home." It took another 2 hours to pull Rachel out of the cave. She was weak, dehydrated, and mildly hypothermic, but she had no serious injuries. After a night in the hospital, she was reunited with her father, who had flown in to see her. Rachel's ordeal left her with more than just physical scars. She was overwhelmed by shame for the mistakes she had made and the resources that had been spent searching for her. For years, she believed being trapped in the cave was the most traumatic thing she would ever face. But her story is also one of resilience. Despite the darkness, the fear, and the hallucinations, Rachel never gave up. She fought to survive, using every ounce of strength and determination to beat the odds and make it out alive. Now in our next story, let's find out if our next cave explorer was able to survive Mother Nature. It was a quiet day in April 1995 when Thomas Edward Benning, a man with an insatiable thirst for adventure, entered Black Cave in Arizona. He had explored this cave several times before, always drawn to its winding passages and hidden secrets. But this time, he went alone. No helmet, no backup plan, just an electric miner's lamp and his sense of direction. The cave felt familiar as he stepped inside. The first room was spacious, its walls glistening with moisture. But instead of sticking to the usual path, Thomas felt an inexplicable pull toward a side passage. It was darker, narrower, and far less traveled. Curiosity got the better of him, and he ventured in. The first hour, everything seemed manageable. He crawled through tight spaces, climbed over jagged rocks, and squeezed through narrow gaps. As the minutes turned into hours, Thomas began to realize something was wrong. The passage he had taken was not leading him back to the entrance. Instead, it was spiraling deeper into the cave's maze-like depths. Panic set in as he tried to retrace his steps. The walls of the cave seemed to close in around him, their shadows playing tricks on his mind. His miner's lamp, his only source of light, began to flicker. He shook it, hoping it was just a loose connection. But the light grew dimmer with each passing second. Then, without warning, the lamp went out. Thomas was plunged into total darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows sound, space, and time. He fumbled in his pockets, searching for anything that could help. His fingers closed around a small matchbook. With trembling hands, he struck a match. The tiny flame barely illuminated the rocks around him, but it was enough to give him a sliver of hope. He used the matches sparingly, lighting one at a time to guide his way, but matches don't last long. After the final one burned out, Thomas was left in complete darkness once again. Desperation took hold as he crawled forward, feeling the walls for any sign of an exit. To mark his path, he left behind small objects, his shoe insole, a torn trash bag, and strips of his clothing. These were his breadcrumbs, his only hope of finding his way back. But the cave was relentless. Its passages twisted and turned, leading him further into its depths. Hours turned into days. Thomas was exhausted, starving, and dehydrated. His body ached from the constant crawling and climbing. His mind began to play tricks on him, conjuring images of light and sound that weren't there. But he couldn't give up. Somewhere, he told himself, there had to be a way out. That's when he found the fissure. It was a narrow crack in the rock, barely 4 feet deep, and just wide enough to squeeze through. To Thomas, it looked like a possible escape route. Maybe it led to an open area. Maybe it would take him back toward the entrance. With the last of his strength, he lowered himself into the gap, but the cave had other plans. As soon as his hips dropped past the narrowest point, he realized his mistake. The sharp rock walls pressed against him from both sides, holding him in place. He tried to shift his weight, but the rough stone dug into his skin, making movement impossible. He pushed against the walls with his hands, but his body wouldn't budge. Thomas was trapped. He thrashed and kicked, but each movement only drove him deeper into the crevice. His arms, weak from hours of crawling, had no strength left to free him. His legs were pinned, his body locked in place by the unyielding rock. Even if he called for help, his voice was too weak to carry through the dense, empty space. No one could hear him. He was completely alone. Hours turned into days. Thomas's breathing grew shallow, his body weakening from dehydration and exhaustion. The cave, once a place of fascination, had become his tomb. The darkness was absolute, the silence deafening. His mind drifted between reality and delirium, clinging to the faint hope that someone, somewhere, would find him. But no one knew where he was. Thomas had not told anyone exactly which cave he was exploring that day. When he didn't return home, his wife grew worried. She called the police, who began searching the area. They checked every cave Thomas had ever mentioned, but Black Cave was not on their radar. It took days for them to find his car parked near the cave's entrance. Rescue teams were called in, but they faced a daunting challenge. Black Cave was a maze of hidden passages, many of which were unmapped. The rescuers searched the main sections of the cave, finding only Thomas's shirt and sunglasses near the entrance. They missed the obscure side passage he had taken, the one that led to his tragic fate. Meanwhile, deep within the cave, Thomas's struggle was coming to an end. His body, battered and broken, could no longer fight. His sharp and determined mind began to fade. The last thing he felt was the cold, unyielding rock pressing against him, a final embrace from the cave he had loved so much. The search for Thomas was called off after weeks of fruitless effort. His wife refused to give up, posting flyers and pleading with authorities to continue the search. But with no leads and no clues, there was little they could do. Thomas was declared missing, his fate a mystery. It wasn't until December 1996, more than a year and a half later, that the truth was finally uncovered. A group of experienced cave explorers, Bill Graff, Elizabeth Robb, and Dale Green, entered Black Cave as part of a mapping project. They weren't searching for Thomas. They were there to document the cave's hidden passages. About an hour into their exploration, they found something strange, a burned matchbook lying in the dirt. Further on, they discovered a broken miner's lamp. The clues were scattered: matchsticks, torn clothing, and small objects left behind as markers. It was as if the cave itself was telling a story, one of desperation and survival. Curiosity led them deeper into the cave, following the trail of clues. They crawled through narrow tunnels, their headlamps casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then they found it: a shoe, a sock, and finally, a huge bundle of fur on the cave floor. But it wasn't fur. As they got closer, the horrifying truth became clear. They had found Thomas Edward Benning. His body, preserved by the cave's cool, damp environment, was still wedged in the narrow fissure where he had died. The rescuers were stunned. They had heard about Thomas's disappearance, but never imagined they would be the ones to find him. The scene was haunting. Deep scratches marred the rock walls, evidence of Thomas's desperate struggle to free himself. His wallet, still in his pocket, confirmed his identity. The cavers photographed the scene, collected the keys they found for identification, and placed reflective markers to guide others back to the body. They immediately reported their discovery to the sheriff. Days later, a recovery operation began. People familiar with the cave's tight spaces were called in to assist. After several difficult trips into the cave, they managed to recover Thomas's body. It had been nearly 20 months since Thomas had entered Black Cave. 20 months of darkness, isolation, and uncertainty for his family. If only the rescuers had known the cave's secrets. If only they had called in explorers familiar with its hidden passages, perhaps Thomas could have been found alive. Black Cave kept its secrets well. It was a place of beauty and danger, a reminder of how quickly adventure can turn into tragedy. Thomas's story is a cautionary tale, one that underscores the importance of preparation, communication, and respect for the unforgiving power of nature. This brings us to our next story, and still wondering why anyone would put their lives at risk against Mother Nature. It seems like a big risk for little reward. On August 18, 2007, 15-year-old Tim Smafield and his twin brother Tom set out for an adventure they had been eagerly anticipating for weeks. Both were avid explorers, having spent much of their childhood navigating the forests, lakes, and hills surrounding their Arkansas home. Their destination was Devil's Den Cave, a place known for its tight squeezes, deep crevices, and eerie beauty. Devil's Den Cave, which is located in none other than Devil's Den State Park. This cave is one of Arkansas's most famous caves. Scientists say that it was formed over millions of years by the slow dissolution of limestone. This cave is a labyrinth of narrow passages, hidden chambers, and stunning rock formations. It's a place that has fascinated explorers for decades, but it's also one that demands respect. The cave's tight spaces and unpredictable terrain have claimed their share of victims over the years, a fact that Tim and Tom were well aware of. But the brothers were no strangers to adventure. They had grown up exploring the rugged landscapes of the Ozarks, honing their skills in navigation, climbing, and problem-solving. For them, Devil's Den Cave was the ultimate challenge, a place where they could test their limits and push their boundaries. The hike to the cave entrance took them through dense forest, the air filled with the chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves. The ground beneath their feet grew increasingly rocky as they approached the cave, the terrain shifting from soft earth to jagged stone. They passed along the edges of crystal-clear lakes, their surfaces shimmering in the sunlight, before finally reaching the cave's entrance. A gaping hole in the hillside greeted them, cool air seeping out from its depths. For Tim and Tom, the thrill of the unknown was irresistible. They paused for a moment, adjusting their headlamps and checking their gear before stepping into the darkness. The cave was a place of eerie beauty, its walls lined with smooth, water-carved stone and sparkling mineral deposits. The air got cooler the deeper they went, a welcome relief from the summer heat outside. Their headlamps cut through the inky blackness, casting long shadows on the walls as they navigated the narrow passages. The brothers moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the silence. They knew the cave's reputation for tight squeezes and deep crevices, but they were confident in their abilities. For Tim, the challenges only added to the excitement. He had always been the more daring of the two, the one willing to take risks for the thrill of discovery. Then, Tim saw it, a narrow 9-inch wide crack in the rock. It was a fissure, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. The walls of the crack were smooth and wet, their surfaces glistening in the light of Tim's headlamp. Tom hesitated, suggesting they stick to the easier sections of the cave. But Tim's curiosity got the better of him. Ignoring his brother's caution, Tim squeezed into the crevice. The walls pressed against his body, forcing him to twist and contort as he inched deeper. The crack was about 20 feet long and 15 feet high, a tight, claustrophobic space that tested even Tim's adventurous spirit. Then, disaster struck. Tim's foot hit a fragile patch of rock at the bottom of the crevice. With no warning, it slipped. His left leg became jammed in the narrow space, wedged tightly between two unforgiving rock faces. His other leg, already resting on the slick walls, gave way as well, causing him to stretch awkwardly. He was pinned, his body torn between the crushing weight of the rock and the agonizing stretch of his trapped leg. Panic surged through him. He called out for Tom, his voice strained and desperate. Tom, hearing his brother's cries, rushed to the top of the fissure. He crouched down, trying to get a better look, but the narrow gap made it impossible for him to reach Tim. He could see his brother's face, twisted in pain, but there was nothing he could do to help. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tom made a split-second decision. He bolted out of the cave, sprinting through the forest toward the park's visitor center. The hike that had taken them an hour to complete was now a race against time. Tom pushed himself to the limit, his legs burning as he navigated the rocky terrain. He stumbled and fell several times, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. By 5:30 in the afternoon, Tom reached the visitor center, breathless and frantic. The park rangers, Jeremy Bruce and Tim Scott, immediately sprang into action. They grabbed their rescue gear, ropes, webbing, and medical supplies, and followed Tom back to the cave. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky as they arrived at the cave entrance. Bruce and Scott quickly assessed the situation, preparing themselves mentally for what they might encounter in the tight, dark passageways. When they reached the crevice, they realized the situation was far more complex than they had hoped. Tim was deep in the crack, his voice echoing faintly up through the rock. The narrow passage made it difficult even to see him clearly, and the angle of his body made rescue efforts nearly impossible. The rangers tried using tubular webbing to pull Tim free, instructing him to tie it around his torso. But the narrow crevice and the awkward angle of his body made it impossible to lift him with brute force alone. Tim cried out in pain as the pressure on his trapped leg became too much. Realizing they needed more help, Bruce called for backup. By 7:50 in the evening, cave rescue teams had arrived. Pulling Tim sideways through the crevice wasn't going to work. The only option was to lift him straight up, but they had to do it carefully. Any misstep could worsen his injuries. Ranger Jeremy Bruce climbed onto a ledge above the crevice, positioning himself directly over Tim. He lowered a loop of webbing down, encouraging Tim to work it beneath his arms and around his chest. Tim, exhausted and in pain, followed their instructions, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the webbing. The rescuers began to pull, inch by inch. Every tug brought excruciating pain as Tim's leg fought against the rock. The walls of the crevice scraped against his skin, leaving raw, bleeding wounds. Slowly, his trapped foot began to loosen. The rangers pulled harder, their muscles straining as they worked to free him. Tim's body rose higher, his legs finally clearing the narrowest part of the crevice. With a final, desperate effort, they pulled him free. It was 8:20 in the evening when Tim was finally pulled to safety. His legs were bruised and swollen, but miraculously, he had escaped without any severe injuries. The ordeal had lasted hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Tim was carried out of the cave on a stretcher, his body weak and trembling from the ordeal. The cool night air was a welcome relief after hours spent in the cave's damp, claustrophobic depths. The rescue team worked quickly to assess his condition. He was dehydrated and suffering from mild hypothermia, but otherwise, he was in good shape. They wrapped him in blankets and gave him water, monitoring his vital signs as they prepared to transport him to the hospital. Tom stayed by his brother's side, his face pale with worry. Devil's Den Cave is a place of incredible beauty, but it's also a place that demands respect. Its tight squeezes and deep crevices can be deadly for those who underestimate its challenges. The cave's unique geology, formed over millions of years by the slow dissolution of limestone, creates a labyrinth of passages that can be difficult to navigate, even for seasoned explorers. For Tim, the experience was a wake-up call. He had always been the more daring of the two, the one willing to take risks for the thrill of discovery. But after his ordeal in the crevice, he realized that adventure comes with responsibility. "I learned a lot that day," Tim said later. "I learned that it's okay to take risks, but you have to be smart about it. You have to know your limits and respect the environment you're in." Devil's Den Cave remains a popular destination for cavers and adventurers, but it's also a place of caution. The park has implemented stricter safety measures in recent years, including mandatory permits and guided tours for those who want to explore the cave's depths.